In the final years of the Russian Empire, discontent had been simmering for decades. By 1917, the world was on the brink of a massive upheaval. It wasn't just the war that would change the course of history. The Russian Revolution, specifically the October Revolution, would forever alter the balance of power in Russia and set the stage for the rise of the Soviet Union. But what sparked the flames of revolution? In this episode, we'll take a deep dive into the October Revolution, one of the
Comrades,
most
the
pivotal
time
events
for
of
revolution
the 20th
is
century.
now.
We'll
We must
explore the
seize this
causes,
moment.
key moments, and aftermath of this radical upheaval, with a focus on the leadership of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. But that's not all. There are stories behind the revolution that still remain shrouded in mystery and intrigue. As we journey through the revolution, we'll uncover shocking facts, lesser-known tales, and the legacy of a movement that changed the course of history. Join us as we embark on this fascinating exploration of a time when the world was teetering on the edge of transformation. The October Revolution wasn't just a spontaneous uprising. It was the culmination of years of social unrest, political maneuvering, and ideological debates. We'll start by examining the political climate of early 20th century Russia, where tensions between the Tsarist regime and the growing proletariat were reaching a boiling point. Economic hardships, exacerbated by the strains of World War I, only fueled the discontent among the masses. As we delve into the intricate web of alliances and betrayals, you'll discover how Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized this moment to propel their vision of a new socialist order. The revolution's story is not just about the leaders, but also about the ordinary people whose lives were irrevocably changed. We'll hear from the voices of soldiers, workers, and peasants, whose collective actions helped shape the revolution's course. As we piece together these narratives, we aim to present a comprehensive picture of an era marked by both hope and despair. Stay tuned as we unravel the complexities of the October Revolution, exploring how it continues to influence global politics and ideologies today. This is not just a history lesson. It's a journey to understand how the echoes of the past resonate in the present. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button if you're excited for this historical deep dive, and subscribe to the channel for more immersive history videos. And don't forget to comment with your thoughts and questions. You never know, we might just cover them in the next video. The year 1917 was a time of turmoil, a time when the world teetered on the edge of profound change. The streets of Petrograd, then the heart of the Russian Empire, had already seen the first stirrings of rebellion by February. It had all begun with something as mundane as food shortages, an inconvenience that soon bloomed into a full-fledged revolution. Workers, their bellies hollow from hunger, had taken to the streets demanding not just bread, but a new future. The distant rumble of war was no longer enough to keep the people subdued. Russia, once a colossus under Tsar Nicholas II, was cracking at the seams. The February Revolution, triggered by a volatile mix of hunger, discontent, and the crushing weight of an unending war, swept across Petrograd like a storm. Factory workers, their faces grim and worn, were joined by soldiers, many of whom had grown sick of the senseless bloodshed. They marched together, united not by the promise of a better life, but by the desperate need for a change. On the 23rd of February, when strikes and protests paralyzed the city. No one could have predicted the speed with which it would all unfold. The situation became dire so quickly that even the Tsar, the once mighty ruler of Russia, could do nothing to stop it. Nicholas II, unsure of what to do or whom to trust, gave the order to use force. But the soldiers, tired of their monarch's indifference and weary from the brutalities of war, turned against him. The Tsar's throne was shaky, and the foundation beneath it was crumbling. On March 2nd, just a few days after the unrest had begun, Tsar Nicholas II, facing mounting pressure from both the people and his own generals, was forced to abdicate. The once absolute power of the Russian monarchy had vanished, replaced by a fragile provisional government. But the revolution was far from over. The abdication of the Tsar was just the opening act, the first chapter in a much larger drama. A dual government system emerged. Two bodies now held the reins of power. On one side was the provisional government, a group of bourgeois liberals, educated and well-meaning, but wholly detached from the plight of the people. On the other was the Soviets, the councils of workers and soldiers who had begun to gather power in the streets. The Soviets, led by the Petrograd Soviet, were emboldened by the events of February, yet they lacked clear direction. What they wanted was a government that would represent the true interests of the working class. But the provisional government was stubborn, blind to the cries of the masses, and unwilling to dismantle the old order that had oppressed the people for centuries. Despite the promises of a more just society, the provisional government remained steadfast in its decision to continue fighting in World War I. It was a decision that would prove its undoing. The Russian soldiers, already suffering in trenches far from home, had no patience for the continuation of a war that seemed endless, pointless, and deadly. Workers, too, could not understand why they were being asked to endure more of the same when their country was already on the brink of collapse. The wounds of the old regime still ran deep, and the cries for peace, land, and bread grew louder by the day. The Bolsheviks, led by the likes of Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, seized upon this growing dissatisfaction. Their slogan resonated with the people, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. The Bolsheviks promised an end to the war, the redistribution of land to the peasants, and a future where the workers would no longer be slaves to the whims of the rich. It was an intoxicating vision, and it drew more and more people into their fold. By the summer of 1917, the Bolsheviks had gained a solid footing in Russian politics. They weren't the only revolutionary force, there were others, but none were as organized or as determined as the Bolsheviks. And as the days turned to weeks and the weeks to months, the provisional government stumbled from one crisis to the next. It had no clear vision for Russia's future, and the people began to see it for what it was, a government that had failed to live up to its promises. Lenin, who had spent years in exile, had returned to Russia in April, and now, as the months passed, his influence grew. From his speeches, his writings, and his actions, Lenin projected an air of unwavering certainty. He wasn't interested in reform. He wanted revolution. And in Trotsky, he found a brilliant ally, someone who shared his vision, someone who could mobilize the masses and lead the charge. Together, they began to prepare for the final showdown, By the autumn of 1917, the tension was palpable. It was clear to anyone who was paying attention that the Bolsheviks were on the verge of something big. The provisional government, racked by indecision and internal division, had no real plan for what came next. On October 10th, the Bolsheviks formally decided that the time had come to act. They would launch an armed insurrection. Their goal: to seize the Winter Palace in Petrograd, the last stronghold of the provisional government. As the days ticked down to October 25th, both sides prepared for what would become the defining moment of the revolution. The Bolsheviks' plan was bold, well-organized, and precise. They had infiltrated key institutions, including the military and the communications networks. When the moment arrived, they would strike swiftly, aiming to catch the provisional government off guard. On the night of October 25th, 1917, the Bolsheviks made their move. The revolutionaries, led by the Red Guards and supported by soldiers and sailors, surged through the streets of Petrograd. They were led by Trotsky, who orchestrated the coup with precision. The Winter Palace, once a symbol of royal power, became the focal point of the revolution. The troops entered the palace and captured key officials with little resistance. By the morning of October 26th, the palace had fallen. The provisional government had been overthrown. The coup was swift, efficient, and remarkably, largely bloodless. This was not the violent overthrow many had feared. Instead, it was a symbolic victory, a moment that marked the end of centuries of Tsarist rule and the beginning of a new era in Russian history. The Bolsheviks had won, and they wasted no time in declaring their victory to the world. The Winter Palace was secured, and Lenin, in a broadcast to the people, proclaimed that the power had passed to the Soviets. The October Revolution, though short in duration, had far-reaching consequences. It was the culmination of years of discontent and dissatisfaction, of a people who had finally risen up to demand their due. But it was more than just the fall of a palace or the arrest of a few ministers. It was the beginning of a new political order. The Bolsheviks, now in control of Russia, had set the stage for the creation of the Soviet Union, a socialist state that would change the course of world history. The Revolution of October 1917 didn't just change Russia, it changed the entire world. The ideals of the Bolsheviks inspired other movements across the globe, and the specter of communism would continue to shape the 20th century. The impact of the October Revolution would be felt for decades, as revolutions and uprisings spread like wildfire across Europe, Asia, and beyond. But in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, the Soviet government faced an uncertain future. The country was plunged into a brutal civil war, as forces loyal to the old regime and rival factions fought for control. It would take years before the Bolsheviks could consolidate their power and create the Soviet state that Lenin had envisioned. But for now, on that fateful October night, Russia had been forever changed. The revolution had triumphed, and a new world was being born from the ashes of the old. The year 1917 had been marked by unrest. The streets of Petrograd were thrumming with whispers of discontent, the hum of disillusionment spreading among the working class and military alike. The problems that had festered under Tsar Nicholas II, an endless war, a crumbling economy, and rising hunger, finally reached their breaking point in February. What began as protests over food shortages soon morphed into something far larger, a tidal wave of discontent that would sweep away centuries of imperial rule. Russia, a giant under the rule of the czars, was finally starting to crack under the weight of its own failures. On the 23rd of February, strikes broke out across the city of Petrograd. The workers were tired not just from the endless labor, but from a life spent under the yoke of poverty and hunger. The rising tide of unrest brought soldiers into the streets, many of whom had been deployed to the front lines of World War I, their spirits worn thin by years of bloody conflict. As they joined the workers in their cries for bread, for justice, for an end to the war, the situation in Petrograd became unsustainable. What was initially a small protest quickly escalated into a full-blown revolt. The Tsar's soldiers, sent to quell the unrest, began to turn against their own officers, and soon even the police joined the throngs of revolutionaries. Nicholas II, who had been in command of the Russian Empire for decades, found himself powerless to control the situation. His authority was no longer absolute, and the throne he had inherited from his ancestors seemed to dissolve before his eyes. The people were no longer afraid of the royal family's authority, and the monarchy's time in Russia was over. On March 2nd, 1917, the Tsar abdicated, stepping down not just from the throne, but from history. With him, the Russian Empire crumbled, and in its place, a new, fragile order was born. The provisional government, composed of well-meaning liberal leaders, stepped into the vacuum left by the monarchy. However, the hopes for a new democratic Russia were quickly dashed. The provisional government, while promising reform, was dominated by bourgeois interests. It was ill-equipped to handle the grave challenges of a nation ravaged by war, poverty, and social unrest. Furthermore, their decision to continue Russia's involvement in World War I, despite widespread anti-war sentiment, further alienated the public. Meanwhile, in the streets, another force had been quietly gathering strength: the Soviets. These workers' councils had been born out of the February Revolution, offering a more radical, direct form of governance. Led by the Bolsheviks, the Soviets represented the will of the people, but they were disorganized, divided in purpose, and lacked the clarity and strategy needed to take control. Despite this, the promise of peace, land, and bread resonated deeply with the masses, who had endured so much suffering in the name of a war that offered them little. By the summer of 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and Trotsky, saw an opportunity. They were not the only faction calling for change, but they were certainly the most organized. Lenin, exiled for years, returned to Russia in April, his mind fixed on one idea: the revolution was not over. The provisional government, he argued, had already failed, and it was up to the Soviets to take charge. His April theses made this vision clear. There was no room for compromise with the bourgeoisie. The time for peaceful reform had passed. Russia needed a full-scale socialist revolution. As summer turned to fall, the Bolsheviks' influence continued to grow. While the provisional government wavered and struggled with internal division, the Bolsheviks steadily gained support among the urban workers, soldiers, and peasants. the very groups that had carried the revolution this far. Lenin's words, written and spoken with fiery conviction, promised a future that, for many, seemed within reach, a future where the workers controlled the means of production and the people would finally be free from the clutches of war and exploitation. By October, the stage was set. The provisional government, disoriented and weak, failed to act decisively, while the Bolsheviks, strategically preparing for the right moment, closed in on their target, the Winter Palace, the last symbol of the old regime. Lenin and his comrades knew that the moment of truth was near. There would be no turning back. Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917 was nothing short of momentous. The political landscape was in turmoil, with the country still reeling from the February Revolution, and yet the true revolution was only just beginning. For many months, the Russian people had lived through a period of intense uncertainty. Tsar Nicholas II had abdicated, but with his removal, the provisional government, a new group of mostly liberal and bourgeois leaders, took its place. But despite their lofty promises of reform and democratic progress, the provisional government failed to address the immediate issues that had ignited the initial revolution. The war dragged on, the economy faltered, and the daily lives of the workers and peasants grew even more unbearable. The streets of Petrograd were still seething with unrest, and the workers, soldiers, and peasants, the heart of the revolution, felt abandoned by those who had promised them change. The old world was crumbling, but the new one had not yet taken shape. From afar, in the comfort of exile in Switzerland, Vladimir Lenin watched this chaos unfold. A leader with a vision, he had seen the brewing storm from a distance and understood that the time for decisive action was fast approaching. For years, he had been formulating his thoughts on what the revolution must become. A revolution not just against the Tsar or the aristocracy, but a revolution for the workers, the peasants, and the soldiers. Lenin's time in exile had been a period of reflection, but now it was time for him to return and lead the way forward. When the train carrying Lenin and his comrades rolled into Petrograd on the 3rd of April 1917, it was like the arrival of a spark in a powder keg. His return had been made possible by a series of events: his journey through Germany, the German government's willingness to allow him to travel through their territory, seeing him as a potential disruptor to the Russian war effort. It wasn't just Lenin returning, it was the future of Russia, and perhaps the future of the entire world that had arrived with him. The moment he set foot on Russian soil, Lenin began to reshape the revolution with his powerful words and ideas. He wasted no time. Almost immediately after his arrival, he delivered his famous April Theses. This was a document that would forever alter the trajectory of Russia's revolution. Lenin's message was clear and uncompromising. The time for half measures had passed. He called for the complete transfer of power from the bourgeois provisional government to the Soviets. The workers' councils that had gained so much popularity during the February Revolution. He declared that the war, which had already cost millions of lives, must end immediately. He demanded the land be taken from the aristocrats and given to the peasants. His slogan, "Peace, Land, and Bread," struck a chord with the masses, encapsulating their most desperate needs. It was a promise of an immediate and radical change. To the workers, it was a call for liberation from the oppression of the bourgeoisie. To the peasants, it was a declaration that they would no longer be denied their rightful share of the land. To the soldiers, it was the promise that the bloodshed of war would end. Lenin's ideas were not universally embraced. His vision clashed with other factions within the revolution, some of whom favored a more gradual approach to change. The Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, for example, believed that the revolution should be a more democratic process, one that would include compromises with the bourgeoisie. But Lenin was unwavering. He saw the failure of the provisional government as proof that only a workers' revolution could truly fulfill the promises of the February Revolution. He rejected the idea of collaboration with the capitalist classes and instead called for an immediate and complete rupture with the old order. Despite the opposition, Lenin's clear and radical message began to resonate with the masses. The conditions of the Russian workers and peasants were dire. The war continued to drain the country. Soldiers were dying by the thousands, and food shortages became more common. People were hungry not just for bread, but for justice, for a new world order that would put an end to their suffering. Lenin's message, one that promised to address the most urgent problems, quickly found an audience. The provisional government, meanwhile, was faltering. It had no solution to the problems facing the country. They were powerless to end the war, unable to solve the food crisis, and unwilling to redistribute land to the peasants. Lenin's call for a socialist revolution made perfect sense to those who had been ignored for so long. As the months passed, Lenin's influence grew. He and his Bolshevik Party began to gain more and more support from the people, especially in the key industrial centers and military barracks. The provisional government, meanwhile, continued to make concessions that seemed to go nowhere. They were unable to end the war, unable to give the land to the peasants, and unable to meet the demands of the workers. In the summer of 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were poised to take action. By the time summer had drawn to a close, the political crisis in Russia had reached a boiling point. On the streets of Petrograd and other major cities, demonstrations were intensifying and strikes were becoming more common. The provisional government, struggling to hold on to power, attempted to crack down on the growing unrest, but it only drove more people into the arms of the Bolsheviks. Lenin and Trotsky, his closest ally, worked tirelessly to organize the working class, the soldiers, and the peasants, all the while preparing for the final confrontation. Their slogans, "All power to the Soviets," and "Down with the provisional government," began to echo through the streets, and more people took up the call. The Bolsheviks were not alone in their criticism of the provisional government. The Russian people were tired, desperate, and angry. Soldiers, who had been fighting in the trenches for years, were fed up with the war and with the government's inability to bring peace. Workers were fed up with being exploited by the bourgeoisie, and peasants were fed up with the landless poverty that had been their lot for generations. In the face of this growing discontent, the provisional government became more isolated. The war continued to drag on, and the economic conditions worsened. The failure of the provisional government to enact the changes it had promised caused the people to lose faith in it. Lenin's Bolsheviks, on the other hand, were beginning to look like the only force capable of addressing the issues that mattered to the Russian people. Lenin, ever the strategist, knew that the time had come to act. By October, the Bolsheviks were ready. The military was prepared, the workers were behind them, and the people were ready for a change. The provisional government, paralyzed by its indecision and lack of support, could not respond effectively to the Bolshevik threat. The stage was set for revolution. The October Revolution was not a moment of chaos or violence, as some might think. No, it was a carefully planned and decisive moment, one that would change the course of history. On the night of October 25th, Lenin and his comrades made their move. The Red Guards, soldiers loyal to the Bolshevik cause, stormed key positions in Petrograd, taking control of government buildings, communication centers, and most importantly, the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government. By the early morning hours of October 26th, the government had fallen. The provisional government, disbanded and defeated, had been replaced by the Soviets. In a matter of hours, Lenin's vision for a socialist Russia had taken root. The provisional government, crippled by its inability to address the people's demands, had been swept away. The Bolsheviks were now in control. Lenin had done it. He had seized power, and with it, he had laid the foundation for the Soviet Union. The significance of Lenin's return and of the April Theses cannot be overstated. His vision had been radical, but it resonated with the people who were hungry for change. His return to Russia in 1917 marked a turning point in the revolution, one that set the course for the creation of a socialist state. But the road ahead would be long, and the challenges of building a new society would be immense. For Lenin, however, there was no turning back. The revolution had begun, and he would see it through to the end. Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917 could not have come at a more critical time. The air in Petrograd was thick with unrest, as the provisional government, far from solving the people's problems, seemed completely incapable of addressing their most basic needs. The workers' conditions had not improved. The peasants still had no land, and the war, now in its third year, continued to devastate families across the country. The political void left by Tsar Nicholas II's abdication had been filled by the provisional government. But this new leadership, while more progressive, lacked the support of the masses and failed to offer any substantive change. Lenin, who had been in exile for years, had been watching from a distance. In the chaos and confusion of the revolution's aftermath, he saw an opportunity to seize the reins of the revolution and push for a socialist agenda. But his return to Russia in April was not a triumphant return. It was more like a spark dropped into an already volatile situation, igniting a revolution within the revolution. The Russian Revolution, despite its initial successes, had failed to meet the most critical needs of the people. With a level of clarity only he could muster, Lenin presented his April Theses. His message was simple: there could be no compromise. The provisional government had shown itself to be incapable of fulfilling the promises made to the people. The Bolsheviks must not wait for reform. They must seize power now. Lenin's words were a clear call to action. He advocated for immediate withdrawal from the war, the nationalization of all land, and the redistribution of that land to the peasants. He called for the working class to rise, take control of the means of production, and end the influence of the bourgeoisie in Russian politics. Lenin's vision, laid out in the April Theses, was radical, uncompromising, and exactly what many in the masses had been waiting for. His call for peace, land, and bread struck a chord with the people, offering them a concrete promise of immediate relief. His ideas cut through the stagnation of the provisional government's policies, offering something more substantial, more decisive. This message resonated deeply with the workers, soldiers, and peasants who had suffered under the previous regimes, and many began to see Lenin as the only figure capable of fulfilling their demands. Yet, Lenin's return also sparked divisions within the revolutionary factions. His uncompromising stance alienated many who had hoped for a more democratic, gradual transition to socialism. The Mensheviks, the socialist revolutionaries, and even some factions within the Bolshevik Party itself had believed that the provisional government could still work in tandem with the Soviets. Lenin's sharp rejection of this idea alienated many of these groups and made enemies within his own movement. But Lenin was undeterred. To him, compromise was a betrayal of the revolution itself. Despite the internal divisions, Lenin's influence continued to grow. He worked tirelessly to rally support, traveling across the country and giving speeches that fired up the masses. As Lenin gained momentum, his ideas began to take root in the hearts of millions. By the summer of 1917, the Bolshevik Party was well positioned to act. The revolution was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. But Lenin, with his calculated, unwavering approach, had now made it clear the time for waiting was over. The Bolsheviks would not let this opportunity slip away. The storm was coming, and it was time for the Bolsheviks to take control. The summer of 1917 was a turbulent time for Russia, and though the Bolsheviks had gained significant ground in the wake of the February Revolution, the struggle for control of the country was far from over. The provisional government, still fragile and struggling to maintain authority, was becoming increasingly paranoid about the growing influence of the Bolshevik movement. As the political tension escalated, the country found itself on the brink of a full-scale conflict, not only between the government and revolutionary factions, but also within the revolutionary ranks themselves. By July, the atmosphere in Petrograd was ripe for revolt. Workers, soldiers, and sailors, whose discontent had been simmering for months, poured into the streets, demanding immediate action from the Bolsheviks. They were frustrated with the provisional government's inability to end the war, resolve food shortages, or make any meaningful changes to the status quo. They wanted more action, more change, and they wanted it now. This uprising, later known as the July Days, was fueled by impatience. The masses wanted the revolution to deliver, and they wanted it to deliver immediately. But the Bolshevik leadership was not prepared for such a sudden outburst. Lenin, in particular, was cautious. Though he had been calling for a workers' revolution, he understood that the movement needed careful planning, coordination, and above all, timing. He had always believed that the revolution should not be rushed, that the Bolsheviks must wait for the right moment to seize power. The July Days, however, were not that moment. The workers, fired up by the idea of revolution, took to the streets demanding the overthrow of the provisional government. They believed the time had come to seize the moment, But the Bolsheviks, despite their growing influence, were not yet ready to confront the government directly in armed insurrection. Lenin, knowing that the movement was not yet strong enough to succeed, urged caution. Unfortunately, his voice was drowned out by the momentum of the crowds. The uprisings quickly escalated, and the streets of Petrograd became a battleground. The government, desperate to cling to power, cracked down hard on the protesters. Soldiers loyal to the provisional government clashed with the demonstrators, and in the aftermath, many Bolshevik leaders were arrested, including prominent figures who had once been Lenin's closest allies. Lenin himself was forced into hiding. His position had become untenable, and with the Bolshevik leadership under attack, he fled to Finland, a decision that would prove critical in ensuring the survival of the movement. From his secluded hideout, Lenin continued to direct Bolshevik activities, ensuring that the party's momentum did not falter despite the severe setback. His ability to remain undetected, moving quietly through the shadows, allowed him to maintain communication with key party members and keep the revolution on track. Even from his exile, he wielded an enormous influence on the direction of the revolution, using every means at his disposal to guide the movement toward its ultimate goal. Lenin's time in Finland was one of intense strategizing. While many of his comrades were disheartened by the crushing defeat of the July days, Lenin remained resolute. He understood that the failure of the July uprising was not a defeat for the revolution itself, it was simply a temporary setback. What mattered was that the Bolsheviks did not lose their focus, that they did not lose their vision for a socialist Russia. Lenin knew that revolution was a long game, and he was willing to wait. He understood the importance of timing, that the right moment would come if the Bolsheviks remained patient, disciplined, and above all, united. From Finland, Lenin penned countless letters, manifestos, and speeches, working tirelessly to keep the flame of revolution burning. His writings during this period were filled with a deep and unwavering belief in the power of the proletariat, in the ability of the working class to rise up and seize control of the country. He knew that the masses were growing weary of the war, the hunger, and the inequality that had plagued Russia for centuries. His call for peace, land, and bread had struck a chord in February, and it continued to resonate in the summer of 1917, especially after the failure of the provisional government to address the people's basic needs. Lenin's strategy during this time was not just about writing and theorizing. It was also about building alliances and maintaining the support of key revolutionary groups. He worked tirelessly to unite the various factions within the Bolshevik movement, advocating for a centralized leadership that would ensure effective action when the time came. His belief in strong, disciplined leadership was unshaken, even as his comrades, caught up in the turmoil of the July days, seemed to waver. At the same time, the political climate in Russia was growing more unstable. The provisional government, despite its best efforts, was unable to quell the growing tide of dissatisfaction. Soldiers, their morale shattered by continued defeat in the war, grew more disillusioned with the government. Workers, too, were exhausted by the harsh conditions and the empty promises of reform. The country was facing a severe economic crisis, and every day the provisional government failed to address the most pressing issues the more the people turned to the Bolsheviks for answers. The government's inability to negotiate peace, end the war, and address land redistribution had made it increasingly unpopular. The environment was primed for revolution, and Lenin, from his hiding place, was working to ensure that when the moment came, the Bolsheviks would be ready. He knew that the time for a second attempt at revolution would come soon. The key was unity within the party, discipline, and the ability to maintain the support of the people. Lenin was focused on ensuring that the workers, soldiers, and peasants who had supported the Bolsheviks would not be abandoned. The promise of peace, land, and bread would be their rallying cry. And Lenin was determined to make sure that when the revolution did come, it would be a victory, not a failure. As the months passed, the provisional government continued to falter. The war dragged on, the economic conditions worsened, and the people grew more restless. Every day, the disillusionment with the government grew, and with it, the Bolshevik movement gained strength. Lenin's clandestine leadership, although hidden from the public eye, was a crucial factor in this momentum. His ability to navigate the complex and dangerous political landscape, to communicate with his comrades, and maintain a clear vision of the revolution's goals was what kept the movement on track. Throughout the summer and into the fall, Lenin continued to build the foundations for the final push. He knew that when the time came, the Bolsheviks would need to act swiftly and decisively. He remained in constant communication with his comrades, directing their actions from behind the scenes. It was clear to Lenin that the moment for revolution was fast approaching. The people were ready, and the provisional government was on the brink of collapse. The failure of the July days had been a painful lesson, but it had not deterred Lenin. It had only hardened his resolve. By October, the Bolsheviks, under Lenin's guidance, were ready. The revolution was not just a distant dream. It was within their grasp. Lenin, once again in Petrograd, would seize the moment, and with the support of the workers, soldiers, and peasants, he would topple the provisional government and bring the Bolsheviks to power. It was the culmination of years of struggle, of sacrifice, and of vision. The time for action had come, and Lenin was ready to lead the way. The October Revolution was inevitable, and the world would never be the same again. The summer of 1917 was marked by fierce political turbulence, a time when the revolution seemed to hang in the balance. Lenin and the Bolsheviks had gained a great deal of support, but their victory was far from certain. The provisional government, despite its weakness, still had the backing of important factions, including the military. Workers, soldiers, and peasants had grown impatient with the provisional government's failure to fulfill its promises. The call for a more radical solution, one that would bring immediate change, was growing louder. By July, Petrograd was a city on the brink. The streets teemed with workers and soldiers who, frustrated with the lack of progress, took matters into their own hands. Demonstrations erupted, and people flooded the streets demanding an immediate end to the war, land redistribution, and the overthrow of the provisional government. The July days became a symbol of this desire for action that the Bolsheviks, who had been organizing behind the scenes, were not ready for. Lenin, however, was not ready to lead an armed uprising. He believed that the time for the Bolsheviks to seize power had not yet come. Lenin's cautiousness stood in stark contrast to the raw energy in the streets. The workers and soldiers who had been so inspired by the Bolsheviks felt that the revolution had stalled. They wanted immediate action. But Lenin knew that an uncoordinated uprising would only play into the hands of the provisional government, who were eager to crush the revolutionary movement. In the midst of this turmoil, Lenin went into hiding. His leadership was more crucial than ever, but he knew that the revolt was premature. He needed time to regroup, to ensure that the Bolsheviks were properly organized, and that the people would not be sacrificed for an ill-timed rebellion. From his exile in Finland, Lenin continued to guide the Bolshevik Party, communicating with his comrades and plotting for the day when the revolution would succeed. By October 1917, Russia was on the edge of an explosion. The simmering unrest that had been building for years had finally reached a breaking point. The provisional government, once seen as a beacon of hope after the fall of Tsar Nicholas II, was now a sinking ship. Widely unpopular, it struggled to maintain any semblance of control as it faced an avalanche of problems. The war raged on. Soldiers returned home from the front disillusioned. The economy was in tatters, and food shortages continued to choke the life out of ordinary citizens. The promises of the provisional government had evaporated, and it became clear to the people of Russia that the government was out of touch, incapable of solving the crises it faced. In the heart of this storm, Lenin and the Bolshevik Party had been quietly building momentum. They had been waiting for the right moment, for the precise moment when the people were so disillusioned that they would rise up for a final confrontation. They had patiently watched the provisional government bumble its way through crisis after crisis, knowing that the time to act was coming. And in early October, Lenin declared that the time had come. It was clear to Lenin that the revolution could no longer be an abstract idea. It had to be a tangible force, an overwhelming surge that would sweep away the failing provisional government. The masses were ready, but the Bolsheviks had to organize them, give them structure, and guide them through the final phase of their revolution. Lenin, with his characteristic focus and determination, called for the immediate overthrow of the provisional government. The Bolsheviks began preparing for a decisive move. The first step was the creation of the Military Revolutionary Committee, tasked with planning the attack and ensuring the revolution was carried out swiftly and effectively. The workers, soldiers, and sailors of Petrograd, key revolutionary supporters, were mobilized for the task. They were ready to march to victory, to seize the moment that they had been waiting for. Petrograd, the capital and heartbeat of the revolution, was abuzz with excitement and tension. The city streets, always filled with activity, now pulsed with an electric undercurrent of change. Everywhere, people whispered of the revolution to come. The Bolsheviks, true to their ideology, worked tirelessly to rally support, their rhetoric resonating with the desperation and frustration of the workers and peasants. They promised a new world, one where the labor of the people would be honored, where land would be returned to the peasants, and where the horror of war would be ended. They spoke of a future where power would rest with the people, not with the corrupt elites who had ruled for centuries. But the Bolshevik leadership knew that action was what would change history. Lenin, Trotsky, and the other leaders understood that words alone wouldn't win the revolution. They had to take it. Everything had to happen swiftly, without hesitation, before the government could react. The timing was everything. By mid-October, the final preparations were complete. The Bolsheviks were ready, and Petrograd was their battleground. The night of October 24th, 1917, would mark the beginning of the revolution. Under the cover of darkness, the Bolshevik forces, a motley group of workers, soldiers, and sailors, began their strategic march. They had planned everything to the finest detail, focusing on key locations that would cripple the provisional government's ability to fight back. The first target was the bridges, the lifelines of the city. Without them, Petrograd would be paralyzed and the government's movements restricted. Next, the Bolsheviks focused on communication centers, cutting off the government's ability to coordinate a response. As dawn approached, the revolutionary forces moved in on government buildings, with the iconic Winter Palace at the top of their list. The Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government, symbolized everything the revolutionaries stood against. It was an imposing fortress of old power, where the elite of Russia had made decisions that had crushed the people for centuries. Lenin and his followers knew that if they could take the Winter Palace, it would signal the collapse of the old regime. As the night wore on, the Bolshevik forces moved quickly and decisively. The revolutionaries had no time to waste. It was a swift, coordinated assault, and by the time the sun began to rise on October 25th, the city was in the grip of revolutionary fervor. The provisional government, caught completely off guard by the well-executed attack, found itself unable to mount a significant defense. The government's loyal troops, already thinly spread across the city, were overwhelmed by the sheer force of the Bolshevik advance. When dawn broke, Petrograd was on the verge of a monumental shift. The streets were filled with excitement, the air thick with the promise of change. Revolution had come to Russia, and the old order was beginning to crumble. The government, having failed to mobilize an effective response, was already in retreat. By the evening of October 25th, the Winter Palace had fallen into Bolshevik hands, and the provisional government's last remaining leadership had been arrested. The Bolsheviks had succeeded. They had overthrown the provisional government in a stunning and largely bloodless coup. It was a victory that seemed improbable just months earlier, but now it was a reality. Lenin, Trotsky, and their comrades had achieved what they had been fighting for. The revolution had triumphed, and the people's victory was complete. As the evening fell on October 25th, the Bolsheviks wasted no time in solidifying their hold on power. They moved quickly to announce the victory, and the words, "All power to the Soviets," rang out across the streets. The promise of a new government, one built on the ideals of socialism, had been fulfilled. The Winter Palace, the symbol of autocratic power, had fallen, and the future of Russia was now in the hands of the workers, soldiers, and peasants. But the revolution was just beginning. The Bolsheviks had won the battle, but the war for control of Russia was far from over. There would be resistance, there would be challenges, and there would be battles ahead. Yet the October Revolution marked the dawn of a new era, one in which the old power structures had been upended. The world watched in awe and trepidation as Russia embarked on this bold experiment in governance. The Bolshevik victory sent shockwaves around the globe, leaving everyone to wonder whether the revolution would succeed or collapse under its own weight. But for the moment, Lenin and the Bolsheviks had succeeded in achieving what they had set out to do. The provisional government was no more, and Russia's socialist future had begun. The revolution had sparked a fire that would burn for years to come, reshaping the world in ways no one could have predicted. By October 1917, the situation in Russia had reached a boiling point. The provisional government, weakened by months of ineffective leadership, had failed to deliver on its promises. Lenin, who had spent years in exile, had returned to the country in April, and the Bolshevik Party, under his guidance, had grown into a formidable force. But while the revolution was gaining momentum, the country was still deeply fractured. The Bolsheviks needed a precise, well-organized plan to seize control, and Lenin was ready to make his move. The workers, soldiers, and peasants, weary of war, hunger, and exploitation, were increasingly turning to the Bolsheviks for leadership. Lenin's slogan of peace, land, and bread had resonated deeply with the people, offering a promise of change, a vision of a new world where the people, not the elites, held power. The provisional government, despite its lofty ideals, had failed to address the pressing needs of the people. Russia was still embroiled in the First World War, with no clear end in sight, and the economy was in ruins. The Bolsheviks knew they had to strike quickly. In early October, Lenin called for the immediate overthrow of the provisional government, and preparations for armed revolt began. The Red Guards, composed of workers and soldiers, were mobilized, and the Military Revolutionary Committee was established to organize the insurrection. Lenin's plan was clear. They would strike at the heart of the government, seizing key institutions like the Winter Palace, communication centers, and transport routes. The streets of Petrograd, once filled with energy and optimism, were now electric with anticipation. Workers and soldiers had pledged their support to the Bolsheviks, ready to march on the capital. Lenin knew that this moment was critical. The provisional government was fragile, and the Bolsheviks had the support of the people. The time for revolution had arrived. As the night of October 24th approached, the Bolsheviks were ready. They had infiltrated key positions within the military and communications, ensuring that when the revolution came, it would be swift and decisive. The Red Guards, led by Trotsky, began to mobilize. The city of Petrograd, on the brink of revolution, was primed for change. The 25th of October 1917 was destined to be a date etched in the annals of history, an event that would reshape the world and alter the course of Russian destiny. It began, as revolutions often do, in the dead of night, with the streets of Petrograd cloaked in the cold shadows of a city bracing itself for what was to come. The clock struck midnight, but in the dimness of those early hours, the Bolsheviks were ready. They had spent months preparing, planning, and organizing. Now, with the first hints of dawn beginning to creep across the horizon, they would take the final step, the one that would change everything. The provisional government, fragile and paralyzed, was about to be overthrown. For months, the Bolsheviks had been laying the groundwork for this moment. Lenin, Trotsky, and their comrades had patiently waited, watched the people's dissatisfaction grow, and seized upon the growing discontent. Now was the time to act. The revolution was no longer just a series of protests or strikes. It was a full-scale, coordinated movement, ready to sweep away the last remnants of the Tsarist regime and its successor, the feeble provisional government. On the night of October 25, in the year 1917, the Red Guards, comprising workers, soldiers, and sailors, marched through the streets of Petrograd. They were not a traditional army but a revolutionary militia, a grassroots force whose strength lay in its numbers and its unity. Armed with rifles and an unwavering belief in the cause, they surged through the city, their steps echoing through the cobblestone streets like the heartbeat of the revolution itself. They were on a singular mission: to take the Winter Palace, the symbol of the provisional government's power, and to seize control of the government once and for all. The city seemed to hold its breath as the revolutionaries moved swiftly and decisively. The Bolsheviks had prepared meticulously, knowing that timing and speed were everything. Their first targets were key strategic locations: the bridges, the telegraph offices, and government buildings. By securing these critical points, they ensured that the provisional government's ability to communicate, to rally its supporters, and to mount any significant resistance was severely crippled. The people of Petrograd, weary of war, hunger, and broken promises, watched as their future unfolded before their eyes. This was not the time for hesitation. The revolution had begun, and it would not be stopped. As the night wore on, the Red Guards closed in on their final objective, the Winter Palace, where the leaders of the provisional government were holed up, trying desperately to maintain control. The palace, once a grand symbol of imperial power, now stood as a final bastion of resistance. It was here that the fate of Russia would be decided. The Bolshevik forces surrounded the building, cutting off any escape routes and overwhelming the defenders. Inside, the ministers of the provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, were caught off guard. They had no real plan for defense. The situation had spiraled beyond their control. Their forces, outnumbered and underprepared, could do little to stop the surge of revolutionaries pressing in on them. Despite some brief skirmishes, resistance at the Winter Palace quickly faltered. The Bolsheviks were organized, determined, and ruthless. The palace fell with surprising swiftness, and by the early hours of October 26, the government's leadership had been arrested, its members taken prisoner by the very people they had once ruled over. The victory was largely bloodless, a testament to the Bolsheviks' careful planning and the crumbling resolve of the provisional government. In the streets of Petrograd, as word spread of the palace's fall, the mood was electric. The revolution had succeeded. The people, workers, soldiers, and peasants had taken power into their own hands. In that moment, the dream of a socialist Russia seemed tangible. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, declared the creation of the Soviet government, the beginning of a new socialist era in Russia. But while the revolutionaries celebrated, the rest of the world watched with bated breath. The October Revolution was a bold, audacious move that sent shockwaves through Europe and beyond. To some, it was the dawn of a new era, an era of equality, justice, and freedom. To others, it was the start of an uncertain and dangerous path, a path that would lead to a new kind of tyranny. The old order had been swept away, but what would replace it? The provisional government was gone, but the future of Russia was far from certain. Would the promises of the Bolsheviks peace, land, and bread be realized? Or would they fall victim to the same pitfalls as the old regime? In the days that followed, as the dust of revolution settled, the Bolsheviks moved quickly to consolidate their power. Lenin, Trotsky, and their allies knew that the hardest part of the revolution had yet to come. They had seized power, but now they had to build a new society from the ruins of the old one. The streets of Petrograd were filled with the fervor of revolution, but the reality of governance loomed large. The Bolsheviks knew that they could not simply announce their victory and hope the world would fall in line. They would have to fight for the revolution, not just in the streets but in the halls of power, in the factories, and on the battlefields. The promise of a socialist utopia was tantalizing, but the realities of governing a fractured and war-torn country quickly set in. As Lenin declared the end of the old order, he also faced the daunting task of dealing with the aftermath. The country was divided. The civil war was already taking shape as rival factions, including the White Army, began to mobilize against the Bolsheviks. Meanwhile, the economic situation remained dire. Russia was still embroiled in World War I, and the promise of peace seemed distant, even though the Bolsheviks had made it their central tenet. The workers and peasants who had put their trust in Lenin were waiting for the change they had been promised. The October Revolution, however, was a defining moment not just for Russia, but for the world. It symbolized the power of the people to overthrow the elite, to topple the old powers and create something new. It was a moment of hope, a moment when the impossible seemed possible. And yet, that same hope was tempered by fear, by the knowledge that what had been achieved was fragile and could easily slip away. As the revolution was immortalized in Soviet art and culture, it became more than just an event, it became a myth. The storming of the Winter Palace, captured in Sergei Eisenstein's iconic film October, was presented as a moment of heroic triumph, a symbol of the strength of the people rising up against tyranny. The image of the palace being overtaken by the Red Guards became ingrained in the collective consciousness of the Soviet people, a powerful representation of their victory and the promises they had made to each other. But beneath the romanticized images, the realities of the Bolshevik Revolution were far more complex. The chaos of civil war, the brutality of the Red Terror, and the consolidation of power in Lenin's hands all painted a more complicated picture. The victory of the October Revolution was just the beginning of a long, difficult struggle for the soul of the Russian people. As the Bolsheviks consolidated power, they faced opposition from all sides. The White Army, a coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces, began to gather strength. Foreign interventionists, Britain, France, and the United States, also took aim at the new Soviet government, fearing the spread of communism. The revolution, which had started with the promise of peace and freedom, soon found itself embroiled in a brutal civil war that would last for years. But for the moment, in the days following the storming of the Winter Palace, the Bolsheviks stood triumphant. Their victory had sent shockwaves through Russia and the world. And for those who had fought alongside Lenin, for the workers, soldiers, and peasants who had believed in the dream of a socialist society, the October Revolution was a moment of victory, albeit a fleeting one. As the future remained uncertain, and the battle for the revolution's survival had only just begun. The October Revolution marked the beginning of a new epoch, one that would reverberate across the globe. The world would never be the same again, and neither would the people who had fought for it. For better or worse, history had been changed, and the stage was set for the rise of the Soviet Union. The promise of the revolution would face many challenges, but in that moment, as the Winter Palace fell, the future was uncertain, yet full of hope. The 25th of October 1917 will forever be etched in the annals of history as the day that reshaped Russia's destiny. As the Bolsheviks prepared for the final confrontation, the streets of Petrograd seemed to hold their breath, caught between the weight of centuries of oppression and the excitement of a new world dawning. For weeks, the atmosphere in the city had been filled with tension. It was as if the revolution itself had gathered in the silence of those final days, ready to explode. The Bolsheviks had been organizing carefully, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The night of October 25th began like any other night in Petrograd, cold and dark, but it would end in history's embrace. The Red Guards, workers, sailors, and soldiers loyal to the Bolshevik cause began to mobilize, preparing to storm the Winter Palace, the last bastion of the provisional government. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, as though the people had been waiting for this moment their entire lives. After years of suffering, of war and hunger, the time for action had come. While the Bolsheviks had meticulously planned their revolution, they knew that speed and precision were crucial. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, was caught off guard. They had no idea that the final act of the revolution was already unfolding. As the Red Guards moved through the city, they encountered little resistance. The streets, once teeming with life, now felt eerily still. The Bolsheviks had already infiltrated key points of the city's infrastructure, including the telegraph office, bridges, and communication centers, ensuring that the government's ability to respond would be severely crippled. The Winter Palace, once the symbol of imperial power, now became the focal point of the revolution. The palace had long represented the old order, an order that the Bolsheviks were determined to dismantle. As the revolutionaries reached the palace, the Bolsheviks moved swiftly, capturing key officials, disabling the guards, and sweeping through the grand halls of the building. The soldiers defending the palace, confused and unprepared, offered little resistance. By the early hours of October 26th, the Winter Palace had fallen. This victory, remarkable for its relative lack of violence, was a symbol of the power of the people. The provisional government, who had once represented the old order, was now effectively dissolved. Kerensky and his ministers had been captured, their plans thwarted by the determination and organization of the Bolsheviks. The coup was swift, efficient, and largely bloodless, something that would later be celebrated in Soviet propaganda and immortalized in Sergei Eisenstein's iconic film October. With the fall of the Winter Palace, the Bolsheviks declared victory. But while the revolutionaries celebrated their success, the reality of what had just transpired began to settle in. Russia was no longer ruled by a monarchy or by a fragile bourgeois government. It was now under the control of the Soviets, the councils that represented the workers and soldiers. However, the revolution had only just begun. The Bolsheviks had seized power, But the world was watching, and the road ahead would not be easy. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, the Bolsheviks had to quickly consolidate their control. Petrograd was filled with excitement and anticipation, but there were still powerful forces opposed to the revolution. The provisional government was gone, but the White Army, those loyal to the old Tsarist regime, was still a threat. The revolution's victory was just the beginning of a new and difficult struggle for survival. The future of the Soviet state was uncertain, and the world would wait to see whether the Bolsheviks could turn their vision of a socialist utopia into reality. Despite the challenges ahead, the October Revolution marked a turning point in Russian history. The fall of the Winter Palace symbolized the end of Tsarist autocracy, but it also marked the dawn of a new era, one that would be defined by the ideals of socialism and the power of the people. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, had succeeded in their goal of taking control. But the hardest part, the establishment of a new government, was still to come. The world watched as Russia embarked on this bold, uncertain experiment. Would the promises of the Bolsheviks' peace, land, and bread be realized? Or would the revolution collapse under the weight of its own contradictions? For now, as the dawn broke over Petrograd on October 26th, the revolution had triumphed. But what followed would be the true test of its ideals. The aftermath of the October Revolution, while a moment of triumph for the Bolsheviks, was not the end of Russia's struggle for power. It was merely the beginning. The promise of a new socialist era, one where the working class would finally take control, had sparked a revolution, but it also unleashed a torrent of conflict and chaos that would engulf the country for years to come. The provisional government had been toppled, but the revolution had only cleared the old power structures. What followed was an even fiercer battle to hold on to power. The Bolshevik victory in Petrograd had been swift and decisive, but the rest of Russia had not followed suit. The country was fractured, and the revolution had, for all its fervor, only scratched the surface of the deeply entrenched divisions that had existed for centuries. As the Bolsheviks consolidated their control over key urban centers, the vast rural expanse of Russia remained restless and hostile, and in the army, loyalty to the revolution was far from guaranteed. Almost immediately, the Bolshevik forces were confronted by the White Army, a coalition of anti-Bolshevik groups that included monarchists, liberals, and disaffected members of the military. The White Army was determined to restore order to Russia, even if it meant toppling the Bolshevik government. The ensuing civil war, which would last for nearly 6 years, plunged Russia into unimaginable suffering. Battles were fought on all fronts, and the war-torn landscape was littered with the wreckage of families torn apart, cities reduced to rubble, and a country that seemed to be at the brink of total collapse. The White Army, though divided, was well funded and supported by foreign powers. Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, all fearful of the spread of communism, provided assistance to the counter-revolutionaries, further complicating the Bolshevik struggle. But despite these challenges, the Bolsheviks, under the leadership of Lenin, managed to hold on to power. Their strength lay not only in their ability to maintain control of key cities, but also in their ideological commitment to the revolution and their ruthless determination to succeed. Meanwhile, within the ranks of the Bolsheviks themselves, there were divisions. Lenin's vision of a centralized, authoritarian state clashed with the more idealistic factions within the party, who hoped to maintain some form of democratic participation in the government. These internal struggles weakened the party at times, but Lenin's unyielding leadership kept the revolution moving forward. As the civil war dragged on, the Bolsheviks were forced to confront not only their external enemies but their own ideological battles. In the face of overwhelming opposition, the Bolsheviks implemented a series of radical measures aimed at consolidating their hold over Russia and ensuring the success of the revolution. One of the most controversial and far-reaching of these was the introduction of war communism. This policy was designed to centralize the economy in a time of war, with the government taking control of industry, nationalizing factories, and requisitioning grain and other supplies from the peasantry to feed the army and urban populations. The aim was simple: win the war and build socialism. But war communism came at a steep price. The requisitioning of grain from the peasants led to widespread resentment in the countryside, where farmers were left with little to feed their own families. Famine and food shortages became rampant as agricultural production plummeted. The countryside, already a hotbed of resistance, became increasingly hostile to the Bolshevik regime, and many peasants rose up against what they saw as an unjust and oppressive government. It was a painful paradox. The very policies that were intended to secure the revolution's survival were driving the people into rebellion. In addition to the economic hardships and widespread discontent, the Bolsheviks also faced a growing tide of dissent from within their own ranks. The socialists and anarchists who had once rallied behind Lenin's call for revolution began to question the direction the Bolsheviks were taking. Lenin, however, was undeterred. He recognized that the revolution's survival depended on control, and he was willing to use any means necessary to suppress opposition and enforce loyalty. It was during this time that the Bolsheviks established the Cheka, a secret police force tasked with rooting out counter-revolutionaries and silencing dissent. The Red Terror, as the campaign of repression came to be known, was brutal. Thousands were arrested, executed, or sent to labor camps for their perceived disloyalty to the revolution. The Cheka operated with impunity, and fear became a constant companion for those who dared to speak out against the regime. While the Bolsheviks justified the use of terror as a necessary response to the counter-revolutionary threat, the effects of this repression were profound. The violence and brutality of the Red Terror would leave deep scars on Russian society and contribute to the authoritarian nature of the Soviet state in the years to come. Yet, despite the harshness of their rule, the Bolsheviks managed to maintain control. Their ability to galvanize support through promises of peace, land, and bread kept the hearts of many workers, soldiers, and peasants aligned with the revolution. The Red Army, under Trotsky's leadership, proved to be a formidable force, more organized and ideologically driven than the scattered white forces. The division within the White Army, with its disparate goals and lack of a cohesive vision, worked in the Bolsheviks' favor. The counter-revolutionaries were too divided to present a unified front, allowing the Bolsheviks to slowly but surely crush their resistance. As the war raged on, the Soviet government, under the leadership of Lenin and his allies, took steps to solidify its grip on power. The establishment of the Soviet Union in 1922 marked the official birth of the new state, although the country was still in ruins, and the struggle for survival was far from over. The Civil War had left millions dead and the economy shattered, yet the Bolsheviks, in their determination to create a socialist state, had succeeded in holding on to power. The revolution, despite the heavy toll it had exacted, had triumphed. But the aftermath of the revolution was anything but simple. The promises of a socialist utopia had been made, but the realities of war, famine, and repression soon became apparent. The legacy of the revolution was complicated, marked by profound social and economic upheaval. While the Bolsheviks had defeated their enemies and seized control of the state, they had also created a new set of challenges. The country had been changed forever, and the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. In the years that followed, the Soviet Union would face enormous challenges. The Civil War was over, but the cost of victory was high. The Bolsheviks had succeeded in maintaining power, but they had done so by enforcing a brutal and oppressive regime. The dream of socialism was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile with the reality of a state controlled by fear and repression. Lenin, for all his vision and determination, would not live to see the full realization of his dreams. The Soviet Union, under his leadership, had emerged from the ashes of the revolution, but it was far from the utopia he had envisioned. The aftermath of the revolution was not just about the struggle for power within Russia, it was about the deep scars left on the Russian people. The social fabric of the nation had been torn apart by years of war, revolution, and political purges. The Russian people, who had fought so hard for their new world, now had to live with the consequences of the revolution. The country was still reeling from the effects of the Civil War, and the scars left by the Red Terror would remain long after Lenin's death. In the decades to come, the Soviet Union would become a global superpower, but the price of that power would be steep. The revolution had been won, but the true cost of the Bolshevik vision would only become apparent as the years passed. The world had witnessed a momentous shift in the balance of power, but that shift was fraught with contradictions: hope, despair, victory, and oppression all wrapped into one. The revolution had given birth to the Soviet Union, but it also left behind a legacy of struggle, sacrifice, and hardship that would shape the course of Russian history for generations to come. The legacy of the October Revolution and the Civil War that followed would continue to haunt Russia for decades, as the Soviet Union faced the challenges of building a new world on the ruins of the old. The triumphs and tragedies of that period remain a topic of debate, as historians and scholars continue to grapple with the complex legacy of the revolution. For better or worse, the October Revolution was a defining moment in history, one that set the stage for the world's political landscape in the 20th century. The aftermath of the October Revolution was not the end of Russia's struggle for power, it was the beginning of an entirely new chapter. While the Bolsheviks had toppled the provisional government and claimed victory in Petrograd, the rest of Russia was still deeply fractured. The nation had been torn apart by years of war, revolution, and social unrest. The collapse of the old Tsarist regime was only the first step in a long and difficult journey towards a new socialist state. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, the Bolsheviks faced a number of challenges. The provisional government may have fallen, but the old order had not been completely eradicated. The White Army, a coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces, quickly mobilized to fight back. These forces included loyalists to the monarchy, liberals who opposed Bolshevik control, and generals from the old Russian Empire. The White Army, though fragmented and lacking coordination, was well funded and had the backing of foreign powers such as Britain, France, and the United States, who feared the spread of communism. They launched a counteroffensive aimed at restoring the old order and ousting the Bolsheviks from power. The Russian Civil War, which would last for years, became a brutal and bloody struggle for control of the country. The fighting was intense, and the toll on both soldiers and civilians was immense. Entire villages were burned, and millions died from famine, disease, and the horrors of war. The country was shattered, and the Bolshevik dream of a classless society seemed increasingly out of reach. Yet, despite the chaos and devastation, Lenin and the Bolsheviks held firm. Their commitment to the revolution, however harsh, never wavered. In the face of growing opposition, the Bolsheviks implemented a series of radical policies to consolidate their power and strengthen the state. One of the most controversial measures was the introduction of war communism, which aimed to centralize the economy and provide the Red Army with the resources it needed to fight. Under war communism, the government nationalized industries, seized grain from peasants, and forced workers to toil in state-controlled factories. This policy, though intended to win the war and strengthen the revolution, had devastating consequences. Peasants, who had already suffered from the war and the demands of the Bolshevik state, resisted the requisitioning of grain. Famine and food shortages became widespread, and many peasants rose up against the government. As the revolution continued, the Bolsheviks also turned to repression as a means of maintaining control. They established the Cheka, a secret police force tasked with rooting out counter-revolutionaries and anyone deemed a threat to the new state. The Red Terror, as it was called, became a campaign of terror, with thousands of suspected enemies of the revolution arrested, executed, or sent to labor camps. The Bolshevik government justified these actions as necessary to defend the revolution. But the effects on the Russian people were profound. Fear became a constant companion, and the very ideals of the revolution, freedom, equality, and justice, were undermined by the brutal methods used to secure power. Despite these challenges, the Bolsheviks held on. Their ability to galvanize support through their promises of peace, land, and bread kept the workers and peasants on their side. Meanwhile, the White Army, divided and lacking clear leadership, struggled to mount a coherent defense. The disunity of the counter-revolutionaries played into the Bolsheviks' hands, and over time, the Red Army, under the leadership of Trotsky, became a formidable force. Through relentless discipline and strategic brilliance, the Red Army pushed back the White forces, and by 1920, the Bolsheviks had secured control of most of the country. The struggle, however, was far from over. The Russian Civil War left the country in ruins, and the economic, social, and political landscape was devastated. Millions had died, and the future of the Soviet state was uncertain. But despite the devastation, Lenin's vision began to take shape. The Soviet Union was born out of the ashes of revolution, and by 1922, the Bolsheviks had established a new state. Lenin, who had led the revolution to victory, was now tasked with consolidating power and rebuilding a shattered nation. The aftermath of the revolution left deep scars, but it also marked the beginning of a new era. The Soviet Union would go on to become a global superpower, but its rise was not without struggle. The lessons learned during the Russian Civil War about the dangers of centralized power, the cost of revolution, and the price of freedom would resonate throughout the rest of the 20th century, shaping the course of history for decades to come. Despite the initial chaos and tumultuous years following the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks ultimately triumphed, and by the early 1922, the Soviet Union was born. It was a momentous occasion that reshaped Russia's future and reverberated across the globe. Lenin's vision, one of a workers' state where the proletariat would finally hold power, was starting to take shape. But the road to this new society was paved with struggle, sacrifice, and violence. The formation of the Soviet Union marked the rise of the world's first socialist state. The promise of equality, justice, and the end of exploitation was real for many who had fought in the revolution. Yet, while the revolution had ignited hope in the hearts of workers and peasants, it also left behind deep scars, both for the people of Russia and for the world. Political repression became a grim reality, and the old social structures, those of the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and even the traditional church, were shattered. But in this destruction, a new order was slowly taking root, one that would influence global politics for decades to come. As the Soviet Union began to take form, the government's intentions were clear: to create a classless society. The people who had been oppressed for centuries were now supposed to inherit the fruits of their labor. In the aftermath of revolution, the Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, sought to redefine society itself. The state moved swiftly to nationalize industries, placing them under the control of the people, and redistributed land to the peasants who had long been denied it. These measures were revolutionary in nature, a radical departure from the capitalist economy that had defined Russia's past. But they also revealed the monumental challenges of turning these ideals into reality. The sweeping changes brought by the Bolshevik government were not without consequences. The process of nationalization and collectivization aimed to eradicate the old class distinctions, but it also created new tensions. In the cities, workers were now in charge of factories, but the immense difficulty of managing production under the centralized control of the state soon became apparent. In the countryside, the redistribution of land was met with mixed reactions, and many peasants found the new system more burdensome than liberating. The promise of a utopian society seemed increasingly distant as the government struggled to deal with the hardships brought on by war, famine, and the rapid restructuring of the economy. One of the most immediate challenges faced by the new Soviet state was the opposition it faced, both internal and external. The Russian Civil War had not yet ended. The Bolsheviks may have defeated the White Army, but the struggle for control was far from over. The new government was constantly beset by factions that opposed the revolution. These included the remnants of the old Tsarist forces, liberals who had been ousted by the Bolshevik takeover, and rival socialist factions who disagreed with Lenin's increasingly authoritarian methods. The Red Army, under the brilliant leadership of Leon Trotsky, played a crucial role in quelling resistance and consolidating Bolshevik power. Trotsky's leadership was instrumental in turning the tide of the Civil War in favor of the revolutionaries, but the victory was not without its costs. The Bolsheviks had to resort to harsh measures to maintain control. War communism and the Red Terror were both part of the strategy to suppress opposition. Thousands were executed, arrested, or sent to labor camps. Fear gripped the nation, but it also reinforced the Bolshevik hold on power. The revolution had created a new world, but it was one built on the blood of its enemies and the suffering of the common people. The horrors of the Civil War and the policies of war communism led to widespread hardship. The push for rapid industrialization and the collectivization of agriculture, though intended to transform the Soviet economy, caused immense pain. The collectivization of farms, for instance, often led to famine. Grain and foodstuffs were requisitioned by the state to feed the Red Army and the cities, but the peasants were left with little to sustain themselves. The famine of the early 1922 devastated rural areas, and millions died as a result. The Bolshevik government, despite its promises of peace and prosperity, could not shield the people from the crushing weight of economic collapse. Despite these struggles, the Bolsheviks pushed forward with their ambitious agenda. They were determined to build a new society, one based on the principles of socialism and Marxist theory. Lenin and his comrades believed that they were not only fighting for the survival of the Soviet state, but for the survival of the revolution itself. To solidify their control, the Bolsheviks turned to culture. They believed that revolution was not just a political process, but a cultural one as well. Art, literature, and education were harnessed to promote socialist ideals. The government funded cultural initiatives aimed at creating a new identity for the Russian people, one that celebrated proletarian values and rejected bourgeois influences. The state took a heavy hand in shaping the cultural landscape. The avant-garde artists, poets, and musicians who had flourished during the revolutionary years were now tasked with creating works that would serve the goals of the state. Socialist realism became the dominant style in art, literature, and film, a style that glorified the workers, the revolution, and the vision of a bright future. The propaganda machine worked tirelessly to instill a sense of pride in the Soviet experiment and to align every cultural production with the ideals of the revolution. But not all was as it seemed. Behind the official narrative, a tension grew between the idealistic vision of a worker's paradise and the grim reality of an authoritarian state. The revolution had promised equality, but the harshness of Bolshevik policies, the suppression of dissent, and the establishment of a single-party state showed a different reality. The intellectuals and artists who had once celebrated the revolution began to feel the tightening grip of the government on their creativity. The dream of a society free from oppression had been replaced by a regime that was itself oppressive in its desire to maintain control. Despite these contradictions, the Soviet Union inspired movements around the world. Its existence stood as a testament to the power of the working class, showing that the people could overthrow centuries of monarchy, autocracy, and capitalist exploitation. The Bolshevik victory was seen as a beacon of hope for workers, peasants, and revolutionaries across the globe. Communism became a rallying cry for the oppressed everywhere. and the Soviet Union positioned itself as a counterbalance to capitalist nations, particularly the United States and European powers. The success of the revolution in Russia had profound global implications. It forced many countries to reconsider their own economic models and political structures. Socialist and communist movements were born across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, inspired by the example of the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution was no longer just a Russian event. It had become a global movement, one that challenged the prevailing capitalist order. But while the Soviet Union was hailed as a symbol of hope by some, it was also viewed with suspicion and fear by others. The West, particularly capitalist nations, saw the Bolshevik experiment as a threat. The rise of communism sparked a wave of anti-Soviet sentiment, and tensions between the USSR and the capitalist world would shape much of the 20th century. The Soviet Union's efforts to spread revolution beyond its borders, particularly in Europe, led to the development of the Soviet sphere of influence and the eventual Cold War. As the Soviet Union emerged from the chaos of revolution and civil war, it began to solidify its position as a major political force. But the journey was far from over. The challenges of building a socialist state in the aftermath of war, famine, and political strife would continue for years to come. The struggle to maintain unity within the country, to ensure economic stability, and to deal with the ever-present threat of foreign intervention would test the limits of the Bolshevik vision. And as Stalin rose to power, the very nature of the Soviet system would evolve into something far more authoritarian than Lenin had ever imagined. The rise of the Soviet Union was a triumph of ideals, but also a reminder of the cost of revolution. It was a revolution that promised much, but delivered something more complex and contradictory. Its legacy would be one of both progress and repression, of utopian dreams and brutal realities, of triumphs and tragedies. It left an indelible mark on the world, reshaping the political landscape of the 20th century and continuing to influence global politics for generations. The formation of the Soviet Union in the early 1922 marked the emergence of a new political system, one that was founded on the principles of socialism, workers' control, and the overthrow of capitalist systems. Yet the transition from revolution to statehood was far from simple, and the Soviet Union's early years were fraught with challenges. The revolution had swept away the old Tsarist regime, but in its place, a new order had to be built from the ground up. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, sought to create a classless society where the people would hold power. But the reality of governing a country torn apart by war, famine, and internal division was much more complicated. The early years of the Soviet Union were marked by attempts to rebuild the shattered economy. Lenin's policy of war communism, though successful in securing the Red Army's victory in the Civil War, had left the country in ruins. Agricultural production had plummeted, industrial output was stagnant, and millions of people were living in dire conditions. The centralization of power in the hands of the Bolsheviks, along with the violent suppression of opposition, left many questioning the future of the revolution. Would the dream of socialism be realized, or would it be crushed under the weight of its own contradictions? Lenin, despite his vision for a just and fair society, found that the ideal of a socialist utopia was increasingly difficult to attain. The Soviet government took drastic measures to address the country's economic crisis. In 1921, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, NEP, a temporary retreat from full socialism. The NEP allowed for a degree of private enterprise, particularly in agriculture, in an effort to stimulate production and revive the economy. It was a pragmatic move, born out of necessity, but it signaled a shift away from the original Bolshevik vision of complete state control. Under Lenin's leadership, the Soviet Union made strides toward rebuilding, but the road ahead remained difficult. The Bolshevik government faced opposition from within and without. Political factions within the Communist Party, as well as the continued resistance from various groups in Russian society, posed constant threats to the stability of the new state. Lenin himself was in poor health, and his death in 1924 would signal the beginning of a new chapter in Soviet history, one that would be marked by the rise of Joseph Stalin. Stalin's rise to power marked a critical turning point in the Soviet Union's development. While Lenin had sought to build a government based on democratic principles within the Communist Party, Stalin's vision was far more authoritarian. Stalin's brutal methods would ultimately transform the Soviet Union into a totalitarian state, where dissent was not tolerated, and political control rested firmly in the hands of a single leader. Despite the contradictions, the Soviet Union continued to grow in strength and influence. The early years of Soviet rule were a time of profound transformation, as the country underwent massive industrialization and social upheaval. The ideals of the October Revolution were both realized and betrayed in the years that followed, as the Soviet Union became a superpower, but at a steep price. The rise of the Soviet Union was not just a victory for Lenin and the Bolsheviks, it was a symbol of what could be achieved through revolution. It inspired movements around the world, offering a vision of a better world where the working class held power. But as the Soviet Union grew, it also became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the complexities of revolution, the dangers of authoritarianism, and the challenges of building a truly just society from the ashes of an old world. The Soviet Union's legacy, with all its triumphs and failures, continues to shape the course of world history today. The October Revolution of 1917 was more than just a seismic shift in Russian history. It was a spark that ignited revolutionary fervor across the world. Its impact extended far beyond the borders of Russia, reshaping the global political landscape in ways no one could have anticipated. From China to Cuba, from the streets of Berlin to the hills of Latin America, the revolution inspired countless movements, each drawing on its ideals of social justice, economic equality, and the empowerment of the working class. It offered a vision of a new world, one where the old structures of imperialism, exploitation, and oppression would crumble, and where the working masses would rise to claim their rightful place in society. For the people in countries across the globe who were suffering under the weight of colonialism, poverty, and inequality, the Bolshevik victory in Petrograd was a beacon of hope. It demonstrated that the power of the people, when united and determined, could overthrow even the most entrenched regimes. The October Revolution showed that a better world was not just a dream. It was possible to bring it into being. In the years that followed, Many revolutionaries looked to the Soviet Union as proof that their struggles for social justice and workers' rights could succeed. But while the revolution inspired countless movements, it also gave birth to a darker reality, one that would shape the fate of the Soviet Union for decades. As the initial hopes of the revolution collided with the harsh realities of governing, the promises of equality and freedom that had once seemed so vivid began to fade. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union shifted from a socialist experiment into a totalitarian regime that stifled dissent and concentrated power in the hands of one man. What had begun as a revolution to empower the workers and peasants became an era of political purges, repression, and fear. The promise of a classless society was replaced by a brutal state apparatus that controlled every aspect of life, from the economy to the arts, from education to personal freedom. The October Revolution, then, left behind a legacy that was both inspiring and troubling. On the one hand, it was a rallying cry for oppressed people everywhere, a symbol of resistance to imperialism and capitalist exploitation. It galvanized intellectuals, activists, and workers to imagine a new world where the riches of society were shared equally, where the oppressive systems of monarchy and capitalism were destroyed. It gave rise to new ideas about society, economy, and governance, ideas that would inspire revolutions and movements around the world. On the other hand, the darker aspects of the Soviet experience became a cautionary tale. As the years went by, the revolution's ideals were compromised by the very methods used to maintain power. The concentration of power in the hands of a few, the suppression of political opposition, the purges, the forced collectivization of agriculture, and the establishment of a secret police force, the Cheka, later the NKVD, all served to undermine the original vision of the revolution. Instead of creating a society of equals, the Bolsheviks had, in many ways, recreated the very hierarchies they had sought to dismantle. The revolution's promises of freedom and equality had been twisted into a tool of control, and the resulting totalitarian state became a mirror image of the systems of oppression that had once existed under the Tsarist regime. The contradictions between the ideals of the October Revolution and the harsh realities of Soviet rule have made its legacy a deeply complex one. For many, the revolution remains a symbol of hope and inspiration. The early years of the Bolshevik regime, before Stalin's rise to power, were marked by a spirit of experimentation, where ideas about workers' control of industry, land redistribution, and collective action flourished. Intellectuals debated openly, and artists, writers, and thinkers were encouraged to push boundaries. There was a sense of possibility, a belief that the revolution could transform society into something better. But for others, the October Revolution represents the danger of revolutionary zeal unchecked by democratic principles. As the Soviet state grew in power, so did its repressive measures. The centralization of power in the hands of Lenin and later Stalin led to a system where dissent was not tolerated. The secret police became an ever-present force, and political opponents, whether real or imagined, were silenced, often violently. The gulags, the forced labor camps that housed millions of prisoners, became a symbol of the brutal tactics employed by the Soviet state to maintain control. The ideal of a classless society was corrupted into a new form of state-driven tyranny, and in the name of creating equality, the revolution had created an apparatus of terror. The legacy of the October Revolution, then, is not just a legacy of triumph and hope, but also a warning. It shows us the perilous path between revolutionary ideals and the exercise of power. It illustrates the fragility of human rights and freedoms when revolutionary movements are allowed to become authoritarian. It raises difficult questions about how to maintain the revolutionary spirit while ensuring that power does not become concentrated in the hands of a few. Lenin's initial vision for a workers' state was one of democracy and equality, but the reality of power, especially in a society torn apart by war, famine, and internal dissent, led to a system that was far from the utopia he had imagined. As the Soviet Union expanded and grew in influence, its example was both admired and feared by the rest of the world. For the revolutionaries in places like China, Cuba, and Vietnam, the October Revolution provided a model for their own struggles against imperialism and colonialism. But for Western capitalist nations, the rise of the Soviet Union represented a direct challenge to the existing global order. The ideological battle between communism and capitalism would define the 20th century, and the October Revolution was the spark that ignited the Cold War. For many in the Soviet Union, the revolution's legacy remains a complex and contested subject. Some continue to view it as a victory that, despite the years of suffering and repression, laid the foundation for a modern superpower. The Soviet Union, after all, was one of the world's two major global powers for much of the 20th century, and it achieved significant advancements in science, education, and industry. The revolution had propelled Russia from a feudal, agrarian society into the ranks of industrialized nations. But for others, the legacy of the revolution is defined by the suffering it caused the millions who died in the Civil War, the millions more who perished in the gulags, and the many who were silenced by Stalin's purges. The promise of a classless society, where the workers held the power, was overshadowed by the reality of a totalitarian state that crushed dissent and maintained its grip on power through fear. For them, the October Revolution is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the brutal consequences of a revolution that lost sight of its original ideals. As we reflect on the October Revolution today, its legacy continues to provoke debate and introspection. On one hand, it stands as a testament to the power of collective action and the enduring human desire for a better world, a world free from the chains of oppression and inequality. On the other, it serves as a reminder of the fragile nature of that dream and the perilous consequences of allowing revolutionary zeal to run unchecked. The lessons of the October Revolution, both its triumphs and its failures, continue to resonate, offering insights into the challenges that future generations will face as they strive for meaningful change. The revolution's enduring power lies not just in its history, but in its ability to provoke thought and inspire action, reminding us of the complexities and contradictions inherent in any attempt to change the world. The 1,920 seconds were a time of transition for the Soviet Union, as the revolution's initial fervor began to give way to the harsh realities of governance. Lenin, who had led the Bolshevik Party to victory, was now dealing with the immense weight of rebuilding a war-torn country. Yet, despite the deep scars left by years of civil war, famine, and revolution, the Soviet Union was beginning to take shape, slowly but surely. But in the shadows of Lenin's leadership, a new figure was rising, one whose influence would redefine the Soviet state and its very identity. That figure was Joseph Stalin. Stalin, who had long been a loyal member of the Bolshevik Party, had kept his ambitions in check during the revolutionary years. But by the time Lenin fell ill in the late 1922, Stalin was maneuvering himself into a position of immense power. Lenin, increasingly aware of Stalin's growing influence, wrote in his last political testament about his concerns for Stalin's leadership. Yet, by then, it was too late. Stalin had already consolidated control over the Communist Party, sidelining rivals and building a machine that would allow him to dominate the Soviet Union for the next several decades. In 1924, Lenin died, and the power struggle within the Communist Party quickly erupted into open conflict. Stalin's main rival, Leon Trotsky, the hero of the revolution and Lenin's once trusted lieutenant, found himself on the losing side of a brutal battle for supremacy. Stalin, using his position as general secretary, steadily purged his opponents from the party, and by the late 1922, Trotsky was exiled, eventually leading to his assassination in Mexico. Stalin's rise to power was not just the story of political maneuvering, it was the story of a man who would fundamentally transform the Soviet Union, turning it into a totalitarian state that would become synonymous with repression, fear, and an iron-fisted grip on control. Stalin's vision for the Soviet Union diverged sharply from Lenin's original ideas. While Lenin had envisioned a society based on workers' control and democracy, Stalin was more focused on industrializing the country at all costs, even if that meant sacrificing the very ideals of the revolution. The first step in Stalin's radical transformation of the Soviet state was his push for rapid industrialization. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Stalin implemented the first five-year plan, a massive effort to transform the Soviet Union from an agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse. The plan called for the nationalization of industry, the collectivization of agriculture, and the building of massive factories, mines, and infrastructure. The goal was to catch up with Western industrialized nations, but the cost was immense. The collectivization of agriculture proved to be particularly disastrous. Stalin's policy aimed to consolidate small farms into large collective farms, thereby increasing agricultural productivity. But the process was forced and brutal. Peasants who resisted collectivization were branded kulaks, or wealthy peasants, and many were sent to labor camps or executed. The result was widespread famine, particularly in Ukraine, where millions died in what is now known as the Holodomor, a man-made famine caused by Stalin's policies. Stalin's industrialization campaign, while initially successful in terms of output, came at an overwhelming human cost. Workers were subjected to grueling conditions in factories, and the state's control over every aspect of life grew ever more intrusive. Stalin's approach to governance was one of absolute control, where dissent was not tolerated, and political purges were used to maintain his power. The Great Purge of the late 1932 saw the execution of thousands of people, including many of Stalin's former allies and high-ranking party members who were accused of treason. The secret police, led by figures like Lavrenti Beria, played a central role in this purging of perceived enemies, sowing fear and paranoia throughout the country. Despite the brutality of his regime, Stalin's policies transformed the Soviet Union into a global superpower. The economy was rapidly industrialized, and the Soviet Union emerged as a major player on the world stage, particularly during World War II. Stalin's iron grip on power, however, came at a great cost. The USSR became a state built on fear, repression, and control, and the legacy of Stalin's rule would continue to haunt the Soviet Union for generations to come. By the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had emerged as one of the two superpowers of the world, standing alongside the United States in the newly formed bipolar world order. The victory over Nazi Germany, which had cost millions of Soviet lives, elevated Stalin's stature both domestically and internationally. However, while the Soviet Union basked in the aftermath of war, the global political environment had drastically changed. The ideological rift between the Soviet Union and the United States was beginning to take shape, setting the stage for the Cold War. The Cold War was characterized by a struggle for global dominance between the Soviet Union, which championed communism, and the United States, which represented capitalism and democracy. The ideological conflict between the two superpowers would define much of the 20th century. Both nations sought to expand their influence across the globe, leading to proxy wars, nuclear arms races, and the formation of military alliances such as NATO and the Warsaw Pact. At the heart of the Cold War lay the question of whether communism or capitalism would dominate the future. For the Soviet Union, the rise of the United States as a global superpower posed a direct challenge to its vision of a socialist world order. Stalin, though nearing the end of his life, had already set the stage for Soviet efforts to expand communism globally. The Soviet Union sought to spread its influence into Eastern Europe, where it established communist governments in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. This expansion led to the infamous division of Europe into East and West, with the Iron Curtain symbolizing the ideological divide between the Soviet-controlled East and the capitalist West. The U.S., fearing the spread of communism, launched its policy of containment, aimed at stopping the spread of Soviet influence. The Cold War quickly became a series of proxy conflicts, including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the two superpowers clashed indirectly, but with the threat of nuclear war hanging over them. In many ways, these conflicts were not just military struggles, they were ideological battles, with each side trying to prove that their way of life was superior. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated to terrifying heights. Both nations developed nuclear weapons, and the world lived under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, in particular, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, as Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. It was a moment that underscored the immense dangers of the Cold War and the fragility of peace in an age of nuclear weapons. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union faced its own internal contradictions. Despite its military and ideological victories, the USSR struggled with economic inefficiencies, political repression, and a lack of individual freedoms. The government, under both Stalin and his successors, maintained a tight grip on power, but the cost was immense. The Soviet people endured censorship, surveillance, and the constant fear of persecution. The promise of equality and prosperity, which had been at the heart of the October Revolution, had not been fully realized, and the society that had been envisioned seemed distant from the one that actually existed. In the 1980 seconds, as the Cold War reached its peak, the Soviet Union was still locked in a struggle with the West, but internally, cracks were beginning to form. The economy was stagnating, and the government was struggling to maintain control. The leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, who took power in 1985, would mark a turning point in Soviet history. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, sought to address some of the USSR's deep-seated problems, but they also set the stage for the collapse of the Soviet state. The Cold War officially ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, marking the end of an era that had begun with the October Revolution. The legacy of the Soviet Union, its triumphs and failures, its revolutionary zeal and authoritarian practices, would continue to resonate in world politics. The Soviet Union had been a monumental experiment in social and political change, one that had transformed the world in both positive and negative ways. While the USSR no longer exists, its impact on global politics, its cultural legacy, and its role in shaping the 20th century continue to be felt today. The Cold War may have ended, but the world remains divided by ideological and political struggles that were set in motion by the revolution of 1917. The legacy of the Soviet Union is complex, woven with threads of both hope and despair, achievement and failure. It is a legacy that continues to challenge us as we reflect on the path of revolution, the price of power, and the complexities of building a new world from the ashes of the old. The October Revolution was a pivotal moment in world history, a revolution that shook the foundations of an empire and set the stage for the rise of the Soviet Union. But its aftermath left a complex legacy that continues to be debated to this day. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the October Revolution. What do you think? Was it a victory for the workers and peasants, or was it the start of a new form of tyranny? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our future videos. There's so much more to explore about history, and we'll be diving into more fascinating topics soon. Until next time, stay curious. Remember, history is not just about dates and events. It's about understanding the stories of people, their struggles, and their triumphs. By exploring the past, we gain invaluable insights into the present and can shape a better future. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep engaging with history in all its complexity. We appreciate your support and enthusiasm as we journey through these pivotal moments together. Thank you for being part of our community, and we look forward to exploring more historical adventures with you.